The glow of the screen was the only light in the room as Daniel scrolled through his phone. His fingers hovered over her name, Eve. 4 months, their conversations had been a sanctuary, a place where he could peel away the layers of himself and bare his soul. Eve was everything he had ever wanted: funny, intelligent, and captivating. She felt like a whisper of destiny, a dream he had finally caught. Their chats began innocently enough, on a random forum for literature enthusiasts. One witty comment about Pride and Prejudice had spiraled into long, late-night talks. It was a love that grew through carefully typed words, stolen emojis, and voice notes that made his heart race. Every time her honeyed voice spilled through his earbuds, he was spellbound. "I think I could spend my whole life talking to you," she had texted one night, her words sending a thrill through him. "You don't have to just talk," he had flirted back. "You could be here with me." Her reply was swift and teasing. "Are you asking me out, Mr. Romantic?" "Yes," he had typed, his pulse quickening. "Come meet me." It took some convincing, but Eve finally agreed. They arranged to meet in a quaint cafe by the riverbank, halfway between their cities. The anticipation of seeing her face in real life had consumed Daniel for days. What would her smile look like in the sunlight? Would her eyes sparkle the same way they did in the pictures she'd sent? The cafe was charming, with ivy curling over the walls and a hum of gentle chatter filling the air. Daniel arrived early, dressed in his best shirt and clutching a single red rose, cliché as it was. His nerves were electric, his heartbeat erratic as he glanced at his watch. Any moment now. And then he saw her. Eve walked in like a breath of fresh air, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, her every step graceful yet confident. Her dress hugged her figure in a way that made heads turn, but it was her eyes that held Daniel captive, deep, familiar, and hauntingly beautiful. "Daniel?" she asked, her lips curving into a smile that made his stomach flip. "That's me," he said, standing to greet her. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the storm of emotions inside him. Eve laughed softly, her voice like music. "You're just as charmingly awkward in person." "You're even more stunning," he replied, unable to tear his eyes away. They sat down, and the world seemed to fade away. The conversation flowed effortlessly, just as it had online. They talked about everything: her love for travel, his obsession with obscure films, their shared disdain for pineapple on pizza. Daniel couldn't help but notice the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, or how her fingers brushed against his across the table, sending shivers down his spine. "You're not what I expected," Eve confessed after a while, her tone soft and vulnerable. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Daniel asked, leaning in slightly. "Good," she whispered, her cheeks flushing. "Very good." The flirtation was electric, a dance of stolen glances and unspoken promises. When she touched his arm lightly while laughing at one of his jokes, he felt a jolt of something deeper, something dangerous. As the evening wore on, they strolled along the riverbank, the setting sun painting the water in hues of gold and crimson. Daniel couldn't resist reaching for her hand, and to his delight, she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. "This feels surreal," she said, glancing up at him with a shy smile. "It feels like something out of a movie," he agreed, his thumb brushing against hers. "But better." They stopped at a secluded spot by the water, the world around them fading into the background. The tension between them was palpable, their faces mere inches apart. Daniel's heart raced as he leaned in, his gaze flickering to her lips. Eve's breath hitched, her eyes fluttering closed. And then their lips met. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, a surge of passion and longing that neither of them could deny. It was everything Daniel had dreamed of and more, a culmination of months of yearning finally realized. When they pulled apart, Eve rested her forehead against his, her eyes shining with emotion. "I've never felt like this before," she admitted. "Neither have I," Daniel whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's like I've known you my whole life." Eve hesitated, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. "About that? What is it?" Daniel asked, his brows knitting together. She stepped back slightly, her arms wrapping around herself. "There's something I need to tell you." His stomach dropped. "You're not married, are you?" he joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "No, it's nothing like that," she said quickly, but the tension in her voice was unmistakable. "It's just complicated." Daniel reached for her hand again, his grip firm and reassuring. "Eve, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Finally, she nodded, though her expression was still clouded with doubt. "Okay," she said softly. "Tomorrow I'll explain everything." That night, Daniel lay awake, his mind spinning with a mixture of euphoria and apprehension. Meeting Eve had been everything he'd hoped for and more, yet her cryptic words lingered in his thoughts like a shadow. What could she possibly mean by "it's complicated"? Still, he couldn't help but smile as he replayed their kiss in his mind, the feel of her lips against his, the warmth of her touch. He was falling for her, hard and fast, and nothing could dim the spark they had ignited. Or so he thought. Tomorrow, the truth would unravel. And it would change everything. The morning sun filtered through Daniel's window, bathing his room in a warm glow. But the light did little to ease the storm brewing inside him. Eve's parting words replayed over and over in his mind. "Tomorrow I'll explain everything." What could she possibly have meant? He reached for his phone, half expecting a message from her, but there was none. Instead, he replayed her voice messages, clinging to the warmth they had shared the previous evening. The thought of losing her, before they even had the chance to truly begin, made his chest tighten. Shaking off his unease, he dressed carefully, opting for the same cologne he'd worn the night before, hoping it would remind her of their first kiss. By the time he reached the cafe, she was already there, sitting in the same spot as yesterday. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, but today there was no trace of her usual radiant smile. Her fingers were clasped tightly around a coffee cup, and her eyes held a shadow of something he couldn't quite place. "Hey," he said softly as he approached, sliding into the chair across from her. She looked up, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Hey." For a moment, they sat in silence, the air between them heavy. Finally, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. "Eve, what's going on? You're scaring me." She took a deep breath, setting her cup down. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this, Daniel. I didn't expect this to happen, not with you." "What are you talking about?" he asked, leaning forward, his heart pounding. Eve hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the napkin on the table. "When we first started talking online, it was just fun. I never thought it would lead to this, meeting you, falling for you. But then I noticed things." "Things?" he echoed, confused. "Little things," she continued, her voice trembling. "The way you described your childhood, the places you mentioned. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But then I started digging, trying to piece it together." Daniel's stomach churned. "Eve, you're not making sense. Just tell me." She looked up, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Daniel, we share the same father." The words hit him like a freight train. He froze, the color draining from his face as his mind struggled to process what she had just said. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's impossible." "I wish it were," Eve said, her voice breaking. "But it's true. My mother, she told me about him, about the family he left behind. I didn't realize it was your family until we started talking." Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Memories of his estranged father flooded his mind. An enigmatic man who had walked out of their lives when Daniel was only 8. They had never heard from him again. "This can't be real," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want it to be," Eve said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending." Daniel's heart shattered. The bond they had built, the connection that had felt so pure and undeniable, was now tainted by a cruel twist of fate. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice rising. "Because I was scared," she admitted, her eyes pleading. "I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to believe it myself." He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. People in the cafe turned to look, but he didn't care. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of the revelation suffocating him. "I need air," he said, his voice cold. Eve stood too, her hand reaching for his. "Daniel, please." "Don't," he said sharply, pulling away. "I can't do this right now." He turned and walked out, his steps hurried and uneven. The moment he stepped outside, the cool air hit his face, but it did little to calm the chaos inside him. Daniel wandered along the riverbank, the place where they had shared their first kiss now feeling like a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. He replayed their moments together, the laughter, the flirtation, the way she had made him feel alive in a way no one else ever had. But now it was all tainted. How could something so beautiful turn out to be so wrong? Hours passed before Daniel finally returned to his apartment. He collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in his thoughts, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Eve. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I never meant to hurt you. If you want to talk, I'll be at the park by the fountain. I need to see you." Daniel debated ignoring it, but something inside him couldn't let her go. He needed answers, closure, something. When he arrived at the park, Eve was sitting on a bench, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to ward off the chill of the evening air. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "You came," she said softly. "I don't know why," he admitted, standing a few feet away. "Because you feel it too," she said, her voice trembling. "Even now, after everything." "Feel what?" he asked bitterly. "The betrayal? The heartbreak? The connection," she said, standing. "The love." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Despite everything, he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The pull between them was undeniable, even in the face of the impossible. "But it doesn't matter," he said, his voice cracking. "We can't." "I know," she interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "But that doesn't make it any easier to let go." They stood there in silence, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging heavy between them. Finally, Eve stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "I'll never forget you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel felt his resolve crumble. Before he could stop himself, he reached out, pulling her into a tight embrace. She clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt as he buried his face in her hair. "I wish things were different," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "So do I," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. They stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other as if they could freeze time, as if they could hold on to the love that fate had so cruelly torn apart. But eventually, they pulled away, their eyes meeting one last time. "Goodbye, Eve," Daniel said, his heart shattering anew. "Goodbye, Daniel," she whispered. And with that, they turned and walked away, two souls bound by love but divided by fate.